Hello and welcome back to Into the Dark with Travis Fiero. I hope you guys are doing well. I know it's kind of a hard time with everything going on. I know people have been feeling a little bit down, but it is spooky season finally, and I'm so happy about it. And I might have a little story about the greatest mass death event in the history of Chicago. The Eastland boat disaster. On July 24th, 1915, over 2,500 people waited in a light rain on the bank of the Chicago River, ready for a great day. They were the employees and families of the Western Electric Company, and Western Electric was treating them to a long day of boat cruises, games, activities, and ending the night with a cruise around Lake Michigan. So it's a beautiful morning. Everybody looks amazing. People are holding their kids. They're talking to their friends and coworkers. This is going to be a great day. The Electric Company was actually the biggest employer in the city of Chicago in 1915, and the majority of their employees were immigrants from Eastern or Southern Europe. So this was a big deal. They were holding this event for their employees, and it was going to be fancy, and it's on a big boat, and they get to go to Indiana. And they get to play games and they get to dress up. This was just the type of luxury that this demographic of people at the time didn't get to do very often. So this was huge. It was a huge deal in these people's lives. The passengers were to begin boarding the SS Eastland at 6:30 a.m. The ticket takers were speedy and the attendees excited. So by 7:10, the ship was full to capacity at 2,572 passengers. Within the first 10 minutes, people knew something was wrong. It did not take long for people to realize there was a problem. Only 10 minutes after final boarding, the ship began to tilt. Tilts and rock back and forth, back and forth. Now, the Eastland had begun to tilt. The crew scrambled to fill the ballast tanks, attempting to rebalance the ship, but it was too late. At 7:28 a.m., the Eastland lurched towards the port side, tipping completely and landing on its side. The passengers on the top deck jumped, climbed, and crawled their way to the side of the boat that was not submerged. The ones on the lower deck were not so lucky. There was so many people on the second level of the ship, and when that thing tipped over, furniture went flying, people went flying. It was just so many people got crushed by falling furniture, by other people, and then, of course, it starts to fill with water. As the ship tipped, pianos, tables, bookcases, and other heavy objects crushed the passengers. Those left intact were trapped as the river water flooded the deck. A few managed to escape through portholes, but then had to deal with the river itself. There were so many people and debris in the water that there was not room to swim. You either tread water or you sank. Getting to the shore without assistance was impossible for many. Women in peril were throwing their babies to people on shore. Those who were not caught were sucked under the sinking debris. Now, the death toll of 848 seems excessive for the Chicago River. If you've been to the river, it's not that big. It's not the Mississippi. It's a pretty manageable river. In fact, in the area that the Eastland sunk, it was only 20 feet deep. Now, remember, this is 1915. Knowing how to swim was not a common skill. You didn't take swimming lessons as a kid or anything like that. That might be more common now. A lot of people didn't know how. And also, this was a fancy event. 1915. The fashion was gorgeous, but ultimately their demise. So many of these women were just carrying pounds and pounds and pounds of fancy dresses that would drag them into the water. So even though it was only 20 feet deep, they got sucked under. You can drown in 2 feet water, you know? There's another story of this guy. They don't know him. They don't know this guy, but it's just people saw him do this, and he was just a bystander, and he jumped into the river, and he saved 6 women, and then when he jumped in to save a 7th, he just never came back up. But there's so many little heroes in this story that it's so frustrating that we don't know who they were, and that's some of the most tragic parts of any of these stories. Sorry, I told you this would be a bummer. Also, a lot of reports of people getting dragged under by other victims because, you know, there was 2,500 people in this event. And so many of them fell into the river that they kind of fell on top of each other. So there's layers of people in this river, and the people in the bottom layer, who are nearest the bottom of the riverbank, they're trying everything they can to get to air. So they're just grabbing at anything, and usually this was other people. So even the ones that were floating on the top of the water were sometimes dragged under and suffocated by the people underneath them trying to get out. In a span of 5 minutes, 848 people were dead. Cleanup was a long process. During the disaster and for the first several hours, the bodies of the victims were placed where there was room, lining the riverbank and inside any large nearby building. The city of Chicago shut down the pumping stations to the Chicago River, halting the flow of the river so they could gather the bodies that had been swept away by the current. Eventually, the deceased were taken to the 2nd Regiment Armory building, which had been turned into a temporary morgue. Family members and friends came and walked amongst the dead to identify the bodies, but for some, no one ever came. 22 entire families had been wiped out. So who's to blame for this? This event was entirely preventable. There was a lot of different factors that led into the capsizing of the Eastland, mostly stemming to incompetence and greed. Classic. So the owners of the SS Eastland were a man named Walter Steele and William Hull, and they actually knew that this boat was not safe. There had been an inspection of the Eastland prior to this event that had said that it was off balance. In general, was just a poorly made ship. The St. Joseph and Chicago Steamship Company were aware of repairs and rebalancing needed, but had delayed repairs until after the busy season to prevent any financial losses. The ship was naturally unbalanced. 3 years previously, the infamous Titanic had lost thousands due to lack of lifeboats, so a new law had just been passed that every ship needed enough lifeboats for everyone. The SS Eastland had been built in 1903 and was not built to contain the weight of extra lifeboats. Ironically, the additional lifeboats contributed to the unbalancing of the ship. A trial was held after the tragedy to determine fault, but no one was held accountable for the mass death due to the faulty ship. The area where the Eastland went down is the center of Chicago. In the summer, you can see party boats with drunken bachelorettes, families and lovers strolling along the Riverwalk, and people dining alongside the bank. The Reed Murdoch Building, one of the buildings that held the dying and dead after the tragedy, is lit up in colors every night as a festive part of the skyline. Locations where mass death has occurred are never quite the same afterwards. The Eastland disaster left a huge impact on the psyche and morale of Chicago, so it is not surprising that people claim to see spiritual remnants of the disaster at the site. The Eastland went down in between the Clark Street Bridge and the LaSalle Street Bridge. There are reports of people hearing screaming and moaning from the river, only to look out and see nothing. I think I've seen some weird stuff in that water. I can't guarantee, and I'm not going to swear by it, that it was a face, but I've been on that river enough and I've looked into that water enough, and stuff flashes underneath, especially in the wintertime when the ice is over. It's just chunks of ice floating, and underneath the ice, I don't know. On quiet days, suddenly water will splash and overtake the Riverwalk, seemingly out of nowhere. Employees of the cafeteria in the Reed Murdoch building have reported doors being locked unexpectedly, lights flicking on and off, and arriving at the start of their shift only to find that all the furniture has been moved around in the night. The building had opened just 1 year before the Eastland disaster and is now one of the oldest buildings on the river. The makeshift morgue armory was renovated into Harpo Studios, where the Oprah show was filmed. Harpo Studios was actually demolished in 2015, ironically exactly 100 years after the Eastland disaster occurred. But people would say all kinds of hauntings would happen there. People would hear phantom footsteps of whole crowds going up the stairs, which people have theorized that might be when the families came to look at the bodies. There was so many people going in and out, so people think that might be the case. There was also a ghost of a young girl that was dressed in the classic early 1900s attire that could have been one of the victims of the tragedy. Whether there are spirits left behind or just stories, the tragedy of the SS Eastland will leave its mark on Chicago forever. It's today's episode of Into the Dark with Travis Fiero. Yes, please tell your friends, subscribe, and thank you for coming with me into the